Today's text from James 3 focuses directly on the theme of this unit, wisdom, what it is and what it is not. Or to use James's categories, the wisdom from above and the wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. Ouch. That seems pretty harsh. We talked last week about how first century Hebrew writers often used exaggeration, hyperbole, non-literal speech to graphically make a point. In this lesson, I propose, quote, the scriptures often use extremes to draw us in the right direction, to warn against the opposite, and then to invite us to discernment. This was a common literary strategy. They were not trying to polarize, as our culture seems bent on doing. Quite the opposite. Ancient writers knew perfectly well, as we all do, that life is usually lived between extremes. Our actions are seldom fully divine and seldom totally demonic. We are indeed impacted by competing forces, by the spirit, by the flesh, but none of us gives in always and fully to either one or the other. Many choices we make will not easily be labeled as divine or demonic. They may be better or worse. They may be completely neutral. God has given us a lot of freedom as we plan our lives, and we don't need to live in fear that every time there's a decision to make, one possibility is the godly one and the other always devilish. For that very reason, we aim to build into our lives all those characteristics that James considers aspects of godly wisdom: purity, peace, gentleness, selflessness, mercy, sincerity, because then the decisions we make will be wise decisions. First century writers used the depiction of polar opposites as a literary technique, trusting readers to observe it and take it into account. The problem with our current cultural moment is that we polarize as well, but not as a literary device. We do it to condemn and write off those people whose viewpoints are different from ours. Too easily we label our own convictions from above and all who disagree with us as somehow from the devil. That is exactly the kind of so-called wisdom that James warns against in this passage. He says it's envious, it's driven by selfish ambition, it boasts and it lies. Leading this Bible study needs to acknowledge the first century writing strategies as precisely that, literary devices. But as leaders, we also need to be aware of the way our 21st century cultural moment pushes us to polarize in ways that are not mere literary strategies. Our polarization abuses people. It inhibits healthy conversation. It excludes and judges people who see things differently than we do. May God help us as churches to be different from the surrounding culture, especially in this regard. Another issue I would want to address if I were teaching this lesson is that both personal righteousness and public justice matter. The same Greek word is used for both of these two terms. We need to be people of righteousness, that is, internal integrity, people who major on right living, but we also need to advocate for justice, always beginning with what James defines as the gentle approach, but then sometimes also working with righteous indignation and sometimes even aggressive action to promote justice in the world. So righteousness and justice, both together. 2 more points. The lesson material proposes that we need careful discernment to know when we affirm aspects of our culture and when we oppose what our culture endorses. The norms of God's kingdom and the model of Jesus call for alternatives to what the world wants. And yet so much in the world is also good and right and praiseworthy. So how do we distinguish the one from the other? As a leader, you may want to ask the group to reflect on this question. Which aspects of our culture are consistent with the values of God's kingdom, and which aspects are contrary to it? But do it carefully. In some circles, that seemingly innocent question could unleash strong emotions and maybe a hefty argument. We need a healthy conversation climate and a commitment to avoid the polarization that pervades our world, or will likely generate more heat than light when we debate questions like that. So, with care, please. Steve Pardini's helpful comments remind us that the wisdom from above is not on the radical right, nor on the radical left. And I would add, nor is it necessarily halfway between those. It's another way, a different way, the Jesus way. It's the way of valuing relationships over personal opinions, guarding against self-seeking actions and attitudes, planting seeds of peace and being patient as they grow into a harvest of righteousness, justice. Finally, at the very end of the lesson material, I make a proposal. The proposal that we aim to be not only a peace church, but a wisdom church. A church that seeks divine guidance as we discern what kinds of attitudes and actions truly result in the peace and the righteousness and the justice that James says is the fruit of all this. I hope at least some Bible study groups pick up on that proposal and explore ways that we can become that kind of wisdom church. I would want to do that if I were to teach this lesson.